I think the reason so many Christians feel gaslit is when we're like, hey, that's not the way things were. That's changed. That's different. We get accused of being reactionary for noticing what is going on. These things need to be called out, and that all these little culture wars that seem disconnected are actually the result of the replacing of one value system with another.
Hello, my friends. Have you ever wondered to yourself, how in the world did we arrive at this place? How in the world did we get to a place where we are mutilating young kids, where by the time they're 5, we're giving them these drugs that will not enable them to live as adults sexually at all? And doing that in the name of helping them and loving them. And if we don't do that, the kids are taken away from you because you're abusing them. How in the world did we get here? How did we get to a place where we're killing 1 million children a year and we're calling that a right and a good, and those who oppose it are jailed? How did we get here? Well, How We Got Here is a new book out by Jonathon Van Maren, whom LifeSite fans know very well, since the Jonathon Van Maren Show runs at LifeSite News every week. And he is also the spokesman and main attraction for the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform, probably one of the most influential pro-life groups in the nation. In fact, they are so influential that they go coast to coast in Canada arguing for life in a way that very few others do. They dare to say what most won't, and they're effective as anything. They're attractive to young people, and they're just stunning. In his latest book, Jonathon goes not only through how we got here, but also what we need to do from here in order to get to a cultural restoration. You're going to want to stay tuned to this episode of the John-Henry Westen Show with our guest, Jonathon Van Maren. We are on the brink of global war, maybe even nuclear war. This could be the beginning of the long foretold chastisement in which the living will envy the dead. Our only hope is Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, and people hearing the truth of Jesus Christ. And that's what LifeSite News is for. It's keeping Christ in the culture. It's bringing you the truth about the news, always. But the odds are against us. If you want to play your part, then head over to give.lifesitenews.com and support our Christmas campaign today. Thank you, and God bless you. Jonathon, so good to be with you.
Great to be here.
Well, let's begin, as we always do, with the sign of the cross. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. Jonathon, you have done another great work. In fact, this is your 6th book now? What I love about you is you're an incredible activist. You give activist a new name because you are out all the time, which is really, really beautiful. By way of you telling a little bit about yourself to people, you still have a family. You're a young man still with a young family. How do you make that work? Because there's a lot of us in this movement and it's tough. What do you do?
Well, they're with me on this trip.
Awesome.
And so we've taken them with us on a lot of places. And now one of the things about a schedule where you're on the road a lot, you're speaking a lot, is when you're back, you can also just carve up the time. And so when I'm laying out my schedule, I prioritize my family first and foremost, because I think I forget who said this. He said, you can't save the family. You can only try to save your family. And so they have to be your first priority.
Beautiful. And you're a deep man of faith. Tell us about your faith.
So I grew up in a Christian home. I was introduced to all of the concepts now that I seek to defend in the culture. While I was at home, I was surrounded by just really, really stalwart role models who would be embarrassed to hear me saying this, but they are, and they shaped my character. I always say that anything that I've done right is because of the example and influence of my parents, and anything I've done wrong is when I didn't follow the example and influence of my parents. Wow. And so it's one of the really simple stories, and it's one of the things I get into the book as well, is intergenerational religious families are really essential. Those are what are under attack in our culture, but that is actually the vessel in which faith flourishes.
Everyone who reads the title of your book, How We Got Here, will be like, wow, how did we get here? Because it's insane. But they're also going to want to know, how do we get out? But let's start with how we got here. Yes. Give us that in a nutshell. This is crazy. Yes. By now, this is a place where nobody believed we could get to, not even people didn't even envisage what we're going through right now.
No, that is the craziest thing. And the title of the book comes from the fact that I've been asked that questions more times than I can count. How did we get here? You mentioned earlier talking about the transitioning of children. If you had told me 10 years ago, and I've seen horrifying things, as have you, we work in the pro-life movement. You think you can't be shocked. But transitioning kids, like you couldn't even come up with that. And what's really important for people to understand is that we got here because a series of intellectuals and revolutionaries actually laid the intellectual architecture. They influenced the culture, and they brought about the sexual revolution. And the sexual revolution transformed virtually every Western culture in the West, and now the West is seeking to bring those values to the developing world. And I think the reason the history is so important is not because names and dates are really important for everybody to realize, but because it destroys the myth of progress. So many people look at where we are and they have this sense of inevitability, that this is just the way cultures go. Cultures rise, cultures fall, and we seem to be on the downswing at the moment. But it's important to identify the people who brought us to this point, so we can respond to their ideas, we can recognize their influences, we can root those influences out, and then combat those influences in our family. So it's people like Margaret Mead, people like Alfred Kinsey, who will be more familiar to many of your viewers, people like John Money, people like Magnus Hirschfeld. These people began seeding ideas into the culture 50 years ago, 100 years ago, and now we're seeing the fruition of those ideas exploding onto the surface of our society. It is a revolution, and each of the individual things in our culture that we refer to as culture wars, right? Okay, now there's LGBT activism in country music. Now we've got to use our preferred pronouns. And now we see people who are male dressed in female garb on the plane. And we look at all these tiny changes. And I think the reason so many Christians feel gaslit is when we're like, hey, that's not the way things were. That's changed. That's different. We get accused of being reactionary. We get accused of a backlash or igniting a culture war for noticing what is going on. And so I'm hoping that by reading the history, people can feel emboldened to recognize that we got here for specific reasons, that these things need to be called out, and that all these little culture wars that seem disconnected are actually the result of the replacing of one value system with another. A value system based on scriptural revelation. Every Western country, whether Catholic or Protestant, was rooted in some fundamental shared principles to the principles of sexual revolution. And we see this playing out every day in our parliament, in our courts, and in our culture. And all these little culture wars are just manifestations of this huge value shift, this transfer that we see going on.
So it's interesting. I think there's a general opinion that, times just flow and we just go with the flow, and there's people who felt this way, and so they gained the ascendancy, and then, that's how it happened. So you're telling me, no, this was an actual plan. This was a developed project. We got to have one example of that, because for the most part, people, I think that, that they just, I have an idea one day and it's good, and people identify with that. And we've been treating the gays badly, and we just got to. So how did we actually get there?
Interesting that you ended that by saying, we treated gay people badly. That's weaponized empathy, right? Because they essentially exploit your good and just feelings about not wanting other people to suffer, and say, well, now you have to sign on to this entire agenda that includes the sorts of things you mentioned previously. There's many examples I could give. I'm going to give one because the example is both familiar, but there are aspects to this example that most people are unaware of. And that would be the example of Dr. Alfred Kinsey, who started off as a zoologist studying gall wasps, and then he went into the field of sexology. This would be in the early 1940s. He got together a team, and he produced the two Kinsey reports, one in 48 and the second in 53, human sexuality in the human male and sexuality in the human female. And he claimed to reveal what everybody in America was actually up to. And he claimed that 95% of Americans were, by the standards of the law in 1948, sex offenders. The vast majority of them were unfaithful to their wives, used prostitutes, were unchaste prior to marriage. He said between 10 and 37% of males engaged in homosexual behavior, which is the number the gay rights movement used for years, despite the fact that even in 2016, the number of people who identified on the entire alphabet spectrum was still at 3%. So things weren't as bad in an era where you have parades celebrating the behavior as he said they were just after World War II, when we were seeing a religious boomlet in almost every church-going community. And there's so many aspects to the Kinsey story. Of course, he mainstreamed this idea that sexuality begins at birth. And that's because he facilitated the abuse of over 2,000 children. And that data was carefully tabulated in his book. You can take it out of the library and look it up for yourself. But
Table 34, if you're wondering.
Table 34. I almost didn't believe it when I first read about this, and so I got the book myself, found Table 34. Truly chilling stuff. Yeah. But to give an idea of how one guy, so why would this professor make such an impact on the culture, is one of the major slogans of the 1960s is don't trust anybody over 30. A lot of listeners will remember that. There was, make love, not war. It is forbidden to forbid was the French slogan. And then don't trust anybody over 30. Now, keep in mind that the Kinsey reports were accepted as science. And so we needed to follow the data. We needed to follow the science. Even, great Catholics like, William F. Buckley accepted the results as true, but just said, even if nobody's following the law of God remains the law of God, but accepted that this was true. And so what kind of impact do you think it would have when the American public writ large accepts this idea that 95% of people in that country are sex offenders at a point where American church attendance across all denominations is at its peak? An entire generation of young people were told and believed that everybody was lying to them, that most of their pastors and priests were sex offenders, that a huge percentage of their parents were. Even if, let's say, the churches were slightly better, even if you're saying half of the people telling you to live a chaste life, follow God's law, go to church, they're all lying to you. And so it was Kinsey who actually created this sense of malaise. When you see these revolts in the 1960s, they didn't explode out of nowhere at UC Berkeley and the Paris riots in 68. These people were groomed to revolt by intellectuals, and their mistrust of the generation of people who taught them Christian values was based on the idea that they were told all those people were lying hypocrites, and we're still living with the consequences today.
It's stunning because in Kinsey's example, he paid a pedophile to do the abuse of children as tabulated, and it's horrific. Also, though, he, in terms of his study, did it at the prison. So give us a little bit more of that, how he falsified the so-called research.
So if we're going to get into detail, Kinsey presented himself as a very normal sort of middle-class Republican in a very normal heterosexual marriage. The reality is that he was a voracious bisexual who was shooting illegal porno movies in his attic. He was working with Wardell Pomeroy, who we don't have time to get into him, but suffice it to say he was a pervert, and that's putting it kindly, actually. And when he embarked on this project, he was actually seeking to persuade the American public that normal wasn't normal and that we needed a new definition of normal. And so it's really interesting. So as you say, to get his research on the common sexual behavior of Americans, he went to prisons. He interviewed hundreds of sexual psychopaths. He went to the New York gay underground. In fact, so few ordinary American women would talk to him about their sex lives, surprisingly, that he reclassified prostitutes and anyone who had cohabited with a male for 6 months as Susie Homemaker in his data. Even that didn't give him the results he wanted, so he junked 3/4 of his own data. And if you want to know how bad it is, the Kinsey Institute at the University of Indiana holds all of his research for the purposes of continuing his work. They won't release most of their files, most notably the data that created Table 34. And so he did what many of these sexual revolutionaries did, is he created data and he created science to reach the conclusion that he gave in one pithy sentence in front of the cameras, where he said, unless we are going to imprison 95% of the American male population, it is time that we changed our laws. That was his conclusion.
So out of falsehood and lies, out of worse abuse, comes a seed to plant which results in just a horrific culture change. It's so hard to believe, yet the evidence is there.
Yes.
For that, I think a lot of credit is due to Judith Reisman, who was the one who discovered Table 34 as a student of Kinsey's, and then was persecuted. She's passed away recently, but
she was on my LifeSite podcast before she passed away.
Indeed. Yeah. Real hero, but suffered for pointing this out, but actually went all over the world to try and expose this. Undoing the stuff that was done, I could use other words, is very challenging, though. How are you doing some of that?
What I'm seeking to do, especially with this book, is to empower Christian communities to recognize the lies they're faced with. Because in 2024, you are faced with lies every single day, and we are othered all of the time, including by our prime minister, right? He says that being pro-life is un-Canadian. His words, not mine. He says opposing the LGBT agenda is un-Canadian, that we're all somehow foreign American far-right imports. Well, I was born in Seattle, so maybe I am a far-right American import. But the point still stands. I think that a lot of people, when faced at college, at university, in the culture, in their workplace, by the entertainment that they watch, the mainstream culture has become anti-Christian. And as a result, we need to recognize, no, we can trace our genealogy. And let's look at their genealogy now. So how did we get drag queen story time? Wait a second. It keeps on ending up with pedophiles. It ends up with Hugh Hefner, who called himself Kinsey's pamphleteer. Kinsey was the one who inspired him to start Playboy, which turned into the porn epidemic that we see now sweeping both the culture and the church. And one of the greatest tools that the LGBT activists and the abortion activists have at their disposal is this myth of progress, this myth of inevitability. Like, you can't fight us. We are on a historical march, which is why at all of their marches, they have wrong side of history, right? You're at the wrong side of history. Like, I'll take 2,000 years over 30. Like, I don't know which side that they claim to be on, but it is a really powerful myth. It's something that we need to respond to so that people have the context for where we are. Basically say on the back of the book that what I'm trying to do here is giving people a cultural map and saying, you are here. So they know how we ended up here. And they have the courage to recognize that when somebody spouts off some idea about the necessity of sex education, that comes from Alfred Kinsey. That comes from John Money. Not only is it good that you oppose that, but we should. The whole thing needs to be thrown out. It has rotten and poisonous roots, and we should be able to lay that out. And a lot of people, I do think we're in a very weird period now. It's kind of a pregnant widow moment. The old age has ended and the new age has not yet been born. And we're in this middle period now where we don't know what the West is going to look like next. And this does provide us an opportunity to speak truth to people who increasingly recognize that they've been lied to, that the establishments have their own interests, and that there's nothing that we are told very frequently by a Justin Trudeau, by a Keir Starmer in the UK, by a Joe Biden or whoever was actually writing his lines. We can't believe what they're saying. And people recognize that things are going wrong. Ordinary sane people are saying, oh, wait a second, I signed on to Pride, and now they're talking about castrating little kids. So what went wrong and where? And we can say, don't pull back to LGB. Let's walk this all the way back. I find that people are really open to these conversations.
For U.S. residents, creating a will has never been easier. Thanks to My Legacy Will, an online platform free of charge, you can now create your own will and choose to include LifeSite news in it, specify where your funeral will take place, the number of masses to be offered for your soul, and how your estate will be distributed. We would be deeply grateful if you remembered LifeSite news in your will. Visit mylegacywill.com/LifeSite news. Thank you for your support, and may God bless you. Very interesting. Now, one guy doing one study, that's, even if he's evil as heck, that's not going to affect everybody. How is this moving forward? In fact, there's all sorts of, there's not only Kinsey studies, there's all sorts of studies that also do that. But it's related also to funding. Because we watched with a lot of the research right now, one of the things I think the whole wide world realizes now is the whole pharmaceutical industry is run by moneyed interests, and there's a lot of money in it. We just saw Gates saying how, his investment into vaccine is turned back 20-fold. And I'm like, what? Wait a minute, what? Moneyed interests with these foundations also played a part. Did they play a part in this?
Yeah, very much so. So two responses to that. First, the people who funded the Kinsey reports, it's the Rockefeller Foundation and the Ford Foundation, and they funded all kinds of stuff at the same time. So it was both their families, but also a lot of people working in their organizations who specifically wanted to join their organizations in order to choose who got the grants. So there's that. Another thing people need to realize about data is that polling is usually not taken to reveal public opinion. It's taken to shape public opinion because people have a herd instinct and they don't want to be the only guy on their street who doesn't sign on to X. And so just to give you an example, right now they're trying to push for the legalization of assisted suicide in the United Kingdom. So Canada's serving as sort of a cautionary tale, a canary in the coal mine. We'll see how that goes. Maybe we'll know by the time this show airs. But what's really interesting is that the number one thing Dying with Dignity and the MPs pushing this, like Kim Ledbetter, are saying is between 60 and 79% of the UK public support this, the government must move. And so a response poll was done, just first asking them if they supported it, and then telling them three things about what was actually going to happen if the bill was passed. And guess what percentage that dropped to after they found out three things? 11%. 11%. So this poll, between 60 and 79% is garbage. But the reason they took that poll was not to gauge public opinion. It was to shape public opinion. When people were actually given the information, it plummeted, which it teaches two things. One, do not trust data that you're blindly handed, because this data is being commissioned by people with an agenda. Second of all, we should be hugely encouraged by the fact that when people are given some really basic information, they can change their mind, which places the task. This is where the activism comes in, is reaching out to people and getting that real information in front of their eyes.
One of the things with what you do in particular is CCBR has been criticized a lot for, but also incredibly effective for. You do put out what happens. And with the abortion thing, you show the photos, the pictures, the reality of abortion in a way that you're criticized for. What do you think is really the basis of that criticism? I know there's good arguments for it. What's the other's opinion? Even pro-life people say, oh, you shouldn't do that.
Pro-life people don't do it for two reasons. One of them is it's people in good faith who think, it seems kind of mean. It's exploited empathy, because abortion activists, whenever a pro-lifer says, I don't really support that, see, even your people don't really like this tactic. And their empathy is exploited in favor of covering up the truth about abortion. So there are plenty of people in good faith who are just like, well, does this hurt or does this help? And I have all the time in the world for those people. I'll answer all of their questions. I'll lay out our stories. I'll show them baby pictures. I'll explain why we do it. And then there's other people, and we see this a lot. It's like, well, I'm a Christian, but I'm not like those Christians over there. And in a time where we're all being forced to draw our lines, where there's plenty of, formerly Christian churches with pride flags outside, I believe that the day is coming, and it very, very soon will arrive in every Western country where every church is going to be forced to kind of make a decision about where they stand on these issues. And a lot of those people they want to be pro-life, but they don't want to be anti-abortion. They don't ever want to be negative. But do you know what? The abolitionists weren't just happy and healthy slave families. They were anti-slavery. And I'm not just pro happy and healthy babies. I'm very specifically anti-suctioning them to death. Because I've been through dumpsters behind clinics. I've held baby body parts in my hands. And it is an experience that will radicalize you forever, because it teaches you that abortion is not about a what, it is about a who. And if we ever forget that abortion is about a who, as pro-lifers, then we've already lost the argument. Because if we're not talking about the murder of children created in God's image, then who cares? Then I'm wasting my life, if that's not what we're talking about.
You said something there, it might seem off topic, but it's not. It's very, very important. This is crucial because we are dealing with a divisiveness that's intentionally caused, but it's everywhere among good people.
Yes.
And that really, I've seen it, unfortunately, in what I've been doing for almost 3 decades now, but the need to actually sit down with one another in vivo and explain and talk to one another before we spout off on, some social media somewhere, I'm not like him, what a radical, blah, blah, blah. And we're doing this mostly to those on our side.
Yeah.
It's stunning. I'd love to hear your take on that.
Well, yeah, you're getting at the heart of something, is the left always sort of bands together, and they're willing to recognize we need to take back increments. And we seem to do the sort of the circular Mexican firing squad very, very often, where we're judging people for their level of commitment here or there. I divide everything into two sets of questions. Are these good faith questions or bad faith questions? And there are a lot of good people who are understandably confused, because we live in an incredibly confusing age, right? The one philosopher I quote in the book calls it liquid modernity. Everything seems up for grabs, right? All boundaries are being taken down, and we're being caught by a flood of this. A lot of older Christian people have their kids go off to university, come back and confront them with questions that they don't know how to answer, because these things didn't exist when they were young. And so people who have good faith questions, so we need to sit down, we need to walk through these things, we need to recognize that we are really all in this together. On the other side, though, you have bad faith questions, and the purposes of those questions are to move the ball in the other direction. And so there will be people who say, what the church needs to do is to understand that same-sex attracted people have often been badly treated. We need to understand this in order to react to them in a pastoral and Christian fashion. Agreed. But who is saying that matters, right? Because there are people who are going to be saying that, but their version of pastoral care is going to be pushing in the direction of bit by bit trying to change things, to hollow out rules, and to push us towards normalization and then acceptance. But there's other people who are saying this because, no, I recognize that God's law is God's law. On the other hand, it is true that we need to be Christ-like, that we need to have compassion, that we need to have empathy. And so on that side, I always say, well, who is asking the question? And we don't need to name names. You cover many of these specific people on LifeSite. You write about them a lot yourself. And so we all know who we're talking about. But that's really important. If it's, the lady next door who's saying, what about this? You know what? Let's sit down. Let's have a cup of coffee. Let's talk for an hour. If it's, a specific person who's in pastoral ministry and is supposed to be projecting clarity and isn't, that's a completely different question.
One of the things that everybody's wondering is, okay, now what? We know we are in the worst time. At least we've never seen this before.
Yes.
We got here through these machinations, which is covered in here. You need to read it and find out. But it's in a lot of different areas. It's not only in science. It's not only in finance. It's also in what you might call, it's academia of all sorts, psychology as well. But where do we go from here? Like, is it completely hopeless right now? But it does seem there's some hope. Like, we just saw this, like a revolution in the United States with the rejection. The stats show one of the major issues was the very issue that's so avant-garde right now. The trans issue was one of the issues that drove people away from Kamala Harris.
Yes.
So it seems like there's hope on one hand, but on the other hand, even Trump is pushing the IVF and the LGBT agenda and abortion, at least in early stages. Where are we at, and how do we do anything?
There's a couple of answers to that question. I think the first one, and I cover this in the last chapter of the book that's really important, is that a lot of people look at, say, activists or journalists like yourself and think, I got to be doing that or I'm not changing the world. But one of the number one things we need to recognize is that the culture that we refer to, the mainstream culture, is essentially dead, and it's rotting and it's infecting everybody else. And we're not going to retake that culture. What we need to do is preserve the culture that mainstream culture replaced. That is what we need to preserve, like the monks did in Skellig Michael. We need to create these communities that function as arcs where we take responsibility for our kids' education, whether that's homeschooling, classical schooling, a private Christian school that's not part of the state system. We can't send our kids off to the pagans to teach all week and then expect them to come home as Christians. It's not realistic in today's day and age, and it's also dangerous considering the gender ideology in schools. And we need to recognize that communities need to be physical. That we need to have communities where we're covering education, where places where Christians can get together, that they can actually speak with each other, have community together, have community events together, where they can band together and ensure the protection of the elderly and the vulnerable. And our euthanasia regime in Canada may be coming to other countries as well. There's a series of things that we need to do. And I think that giving up on taking back the mainstream culture is one of those things. So that's one of the things that I'll say about Daily Wire. They'll often say, we're going to take back the culture. And I'm like, well, the culture is dead. If you're talking about, recovering the previous culture, now I'm listening. Like Anthony Esselin said, the classics are the great unused artillery of the culture wars. We don't have to recreate a culture. We can just go back and pick up the one that we abandoned and work from there. To give a little bit of a glimmer of hope, which we're seeing so many interesting things going on in this liquid modernity period that we're in, is we talked about how the ideas of people like Magnus Hirschfeld, who first put forward the idea that gender needed to break out of the binary, and everybody thought he was insane for like 80 years, and now, lo and behold, your kids are learning Magnus Hirschfeld at school 100 years after he's been dead. We're seeing all of these questions being asked by people who were once part of the new atheist movement that kind of shaped my university experience, because they're recognizing that the branch they've been sawing off so vigorously for so long is starting to crack, and they don't like what the alternative looks like. So you got Richard Dawkins trying to pretend he's a cultural Christian, right? Which, if things weren't so bad, I'd get Schadenfreude. I don't have it because things are really bad. But when Dawkins is noticing it, okay, things are not going well. I interviewed Neil Ferguson, one of the world's most renowned historians, and he said, I struggle. I got brought up in an atheist home. I struggle to accept Christian premises, but people need to go back to church. We need to reacquaint ourselves with these value systems. It's the foundation of society. His wife, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, recently announced that she's becoming a Christian again. She hasn't even picked her denomination. She's still figuring it out, but she says, I believe in the crucifixion, the resurrection, substitutionary atonement. You've got Charles Murray, who was sort of crucified for his book, The Bell Curve. He's one of the scientists who got ostracized from the academy. He's an agnostic, but he says, short of a religious revival, America won't survive. Douglas Murray is now calling himself a Christian atheist. So the way I put it in the book is we're at this period now where there is now a lot of intellectuals who hated Christianity 5 minutes ago and were very vocal about it, who are willing to say, we need Christianity. And I wonder how far we are from some of them like Ayaan Hirsi Ali saying, actually, we need Christ. because they're recognizing that this was the social glue that held it all together. And they're recognizing that if I've got to pick between Magnus Hirschfeld and Augustine, maybe Augustine's the better way to go. So we don't know. They're planting seeds now. We are in a time of fascinating discussions, right? You know, Jordan Peterson, we who wrestle with God. I wish he'd stop wrestling, because when you stop fighting is actually when you discover the truth. But we'll see. There's a lot of interesting signs of growth, and rotting empires make good fertilizer for revival in the long term.
Indeed, I think what you said about the small Christian communities, if you can call it that, because that's what it's called in Africa. Africa has this thriving thing. You find these pockets of faith, and they're real sincere. You go to Mass in Africa or to a church service, and there's tons of people, and there's tons of men and young kids. Now, they have many more young kids than we do, but there's also this vibrant faith that's just not, for the most part, seen. And I've been to a number of countries in Africa where it's fairly similar. Not South Africa, that's different. But in Kenya and Rwanda and Tanzania, there is this beautiful faith.
Yes.
And I asked a few of the bishops there, I said, what is this? We don't have this at home. And a few of them said to me the same things: small Christian communities.
Yeah.
And it's almost exactly what you described. They actually break it down. Not only is it a church unit, or that's too broad. For them, it's like 10 families.
Yep.
And they work within that 10 families. So they support one another. They make sure they're getting the right education. There, the church still has a strong education foundation. But they do basically healthcare for them. They make sure the widows are taken care of. Like, this is like basically back to what you read in the early Bible about how they supported one another. That kind of thing. Do you see that ever kind of catching hold here?
I think more and more it is. And I profile a few of those communities in the last chapter of the book. I think like Barry's Bay is a good example. You've got a college, you've got a lot of families. When there's an event, people just show up from across the church. There's a lot of big families still. Everybody's committed to teaching their kids themselves, or making sure they get a genuine education, not state education. I actually covered Steubenville as well. There's all kinds of interesting projects where people are, one thing that I noticed there, they rented a big shop downtown. It was like $5 a month for anybody to use this shop. So it's a communal area. People can use practical skills. Somebody from the community can come in, and then suddenly they're around all these people who have Christian beliefs, and you get the opportunity to talk with them, which is something Aaron Wrenn calls pre-evangelization. It's just they see what you're doing and think, oh, I'm attracted to that. So we do see these communities popping up, and I think that Rod Dreher probably started talking about this first, but he was describing something that had been happening for a long time. And so I do have a lot of optimism that these communities not only exist, but are increasingly the model that people are looking at. And, there was a study that came out from Laurier University a couple of years ago. The only growing churches in Canada are traditionalist churches. Because why bother to get up early on a Sunday morning if it's just going to be, Pastor What's-Her-Face talking about the LGBT thing, right? Then you might as well just go to Pride in June instead. So I do think that the new model very much is that. People know that it's necessary. They know that they need that kind of security, and they know they need that kind of community. I think those communities are going to end up being the future. And one of the reasons it's so important, I think, to have these communities, to educate our kids ourselves for years, and you've probably been hearing this for years too, right? Like, people are like, oh, we have more kids than them, so they're going to die off and the future belongs to the religious because we have lots of kids and they don't. And we didn't recognize too often that if we sent our kids off to state schools or state universities, there's two ways you can grow your group, right? One is by reproduction and the other one is by evangelization. And we need to recognize that essentially these are sexual evangelicals, and that they can steal their kids that way. I remember talking at a pro-life conference recently to a Catholic mom of 9 kids. 2 of her kids identify as transgender because between the internet and school, they got access to her kids. And so we need to be so incredibly careful that our communities grow, especially because we need to retain our own members.
Last word, because I think it's not only for kids, but it's also for ourselves, both for maintaining the faith, but also for friendships that are sane.
So there's a couple things. The first thing is, like Anthony Eslin said, the classics are the great unused artillery of the culture wars. There's a lot of talk, but we need to rebuild this culture. We need to create a subculture. Like, we got a lot of stuff already. that we need to refamiliarize ourselves with. We need to train our brains off of TikTok and YouTube and all of these things that we all struggle with to one extent or another. For me, it's Twitter because I'm a political junkie, and retrain our brains to sit down and engage with the great heritage that we actually have. We were given an inheritance, and we can pick that inheritance back up and re-engage with that. I think that's so important. And then I think when it comes to the instinct to argue and to debate with people, I want to emphasize that I understand that instinct, because when it feels like everything that we treasure is under attack, the instinct to anything that looks like compromise, anything that looks like caving, anything that looks like a 1 millimeter in the wrong direction, because we're almost... So we got PTSD from 20 years of rapid cultural change. It's like slam the door on that guy's fingers, right? Call it out immediately. But instead, I think we need the discernment to recognize the difference between questions asked in good faith by people who just genuinely want to know the truth and don't have an agenda, with those who are asking questions in bad faith for the purposes of furthering their own agenda. And we just need to recognize that a lot of times we get really angry at people. And this is not to say that we're not arguing about things that are worth arguing about, but the way we argue about those things and the way we approach those conversations should be shaped by how that person is coming to us. Whereas then there's other people, if they have an agenda, those people need to be called out, because I think this is something I follow in my own writing. When I'm talking to somebody on the street who's really upset and very pro-abortion, I talk to her very differently than Joyce Arthur of the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada, whose job is to defend, abortion all day long. She needs to be treated like somebody who's championing the murder of children. This other person needs to be treated as a wounded person who's been groomed by a culture of death, and instead needs for us to engage with her with charity and compassion.
Absolutely beautiful. Jonathon Van Maren, keep up your amazing work.
Thank you so much.
God bless you, my friend. How We Got Here by Jonathon Van Maren. You can pick it up wherever good books are sold. God bless you. And we'll see you again next time.
Aloha, everyone. This is Jason Jones for LifeSite News. We hope you enjoyed this video. For more content like this, check the link in the description. You can also connect with us on social media to stay up to date with the latest news on life, faith, family, and freedom. Thanks for watching, and may God bless you.